In the City of Angels, the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the person holding your wine glass. Maya Jenkins had learned that silence was a currency. Spend it wisely, and you survive another shift. Spend it foolishly, and you become invisible forever. Tonight, a woman dripping in diamonds was about to mistake Maya's silence for ignorance, and a Korean mafia boss's wife was about to have the worst meal of her life. Victoria Sterling leaned across the white linen table, pointed one manicured finger directly at Maya's face, and unleashed a torrent of vicious, Seoul-dialect Korean, calling her a beast of burden and a mindless servant, with a smile so wide the chandelier caught her teeth. She assumed the help didn't understand. What Victoria didn't know was that Maya's $80,000 in debt came from 6 years of doctoral research in East Asian studies, and that she could dissect the subtle class distinctions of Joseon-era honorific Korean the way a surgeon dissects nerve. Maya set the wine decanter down with surgical precision, looked Victoria dead in the eye, and responded in flawless, High Court John Demel, the Korean reserved for royalty addressing the disgraced. The entire restaurant went cold. Victoria Sterling didn't just freeze. She shattered. The order entry terminal in the kitchen of Obsidian chimed, a sound that had become the rhythm of Maya Jenkins' carefully contained life. It was 8 p.m. on a Friday, and Obsidian, a Los Angeles steakhouse so exclusive it accepted reservations by referral only, was at full capacity. The air was thick with aged wagyu and the particular cologne of men who own things. Maya, 28, moved between tables like a ghost, her notepad steady, her face neutral, her mind running 3 conversations in 4 languages simultaneously. To the industry titans and shadowed figures she served, she was furniture in an apron. They didn't see the woman who had spent the better part of a decade inside university libraries, mapping the tonal shifts between Northern and Southern Korean court dialects. They didn't see the research fellowship she had deferred, or the PhD dissertation sitting unfinished on a laptop she couldn't afford to replace. They saw a black woman whose only visible purpose was the speed at which she refreshed a bread basket. Maya had $80,000 in medical debt, her younger brother Marcus's treatment wasn't pausing for anyone's sympathy, and that debt was the invisible chain that kept her in this apron, in this dining room, perfecting the art of being unseen. She was 3 tables from finishing her section when the room shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure, the kind that moves through a crowd before the crowd knows why. Near the entrance, the maitre d' was escorting a couple to the prime corner table. The man walked like the floor belonged to him. Heavily tattooed hands. A jaw carved from controlled fury. Every server within eye line instinctively straightened their posture. Kang Dong-hae had arrived. And on his arm, wrapped in ice blue silk and a gold chain necklace that could fund a semester of tuition, was the woman who was about to make the worst mistake of her privileged life. Welcome to Soulwoven Stories. While you're here, please hit the subscribe button, turn on your notification bell, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Maya's alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because her body had long stopped trusting rest. She lay in the dark of her Koreatown studio apartment, the irony of her address never lost on her, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling she had privately named the continent. It looked different depending on her mood. Some mornings it looked like Africa. This morning it looked like a bill she couldn't pay. She was out of bed before the second alarm. The routine was precise, almost military. Shower, dress, coffee from a French press that was the single domestic luxury she refused to surrender. While the coffee steeped, she opened her laptop and did what she did every morning before the world asked anything of her, she read. Today it was a dense academic paper on the evolution of speech register markers in late Joseon period Korean court documents. The kind of reading that once made her feel like she was standing at the edge of something vast and important. Now it was the only quiet place left that still felt like hers. On the kitchen counter, tucked under a ceramic mug she never used, was a pale blue envelope. She didn't need to open it. She had memorized every number on the statement inside. Marcus's monthly treatment at Cedars-Sinai, the immunotherapy protocol his specialist had called remarkably promising, and the insurance company had called not yet covered, ran $4,200 a month. Her 2 shifts at Obsidian, plus the occasional private event catering job she picked up on her days off, netted her roughly $3,800 after taxes. The $400 gap was a wound she dressed with credit cards and a quiet ferocity she never showed anyone. Their mother had passed 4 years ago. Their father had been gone longer than that in every way that mattered. It was just Maya and Marcus now, Maya with her 6 languages and her abandoned dissertation, Marcus with his easy laugh and his compromised immune system and his complete, unshakable faith that his big sister was going to figure it out. She always figured it out. She folded the envelope back under the mug and finished her coffee standing at the window, watching Koreatown wake up below her. The Halmoni from the 4th floor was already sweeping the steps of the building across the street, moving with that particular unhurried dignity that Maya had spent years studying in texts and found more instructive in practice. Down the block, the Korean-owned dry cleaner was raising its gate, the owner exchanging quick, warm morning words with the Salvadoran woman who ran the bakery next door. 2 languages. 0 friction. Just people. Maya had spent 6 years in academia arguing that language was the architecture of human dignity. That the words a culture chose to elevate, and the words it chose to weaponize, told you everything about its relationship with power. She believed that now more than ever. She just delivered that belief to tables in a black apron. By 9 a.m. she was on the bus, her dissertation notes open on her phone, not to work on them, but because reading her own thinking reminded her that she existed beyond the borders of Obsidian's dining room. By 3 p.m. she was in uniform. By 4 p.m. she was invisible again, moving through the pre-service setup with the quiet efficiency that had made her the restaurant's most requested server, a fact her manager mentioned to guests and never once mentioned to her. It was a Friday. Obsidian was fully booked. And somewhere across the city, a black SUV with tinted windows was already moving west on Wilshire. The first sign was the valets. Maya had worked enough high-end rooms to read a dining room the way a sailor reads weather. She knew the difference between the nervous energy of a celebrity arrival and the specific, pressurized stillness that preceded something else entirely. At 8:04 p.m., 2 of the 3 valets outside Obsidian suddenly found reasons to be somewhere other than the front entrance. The third, a broad-shouldered college kid named Trey who prided himself on being unimpressed by anyone, stood straighter than Maya had ever seen him stand. She was refilling a water glass at table 9 when she felt it. Not heard. Felt. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It was more like a wave moving backward, conversation dropping at the entrance and rippling toward the interior, table by table, until the ambient noise of Obsidian's carefully curated Friday night had compressed itself into something hushed and careful. Even the jazz quartet in the corner seemed to collectively pull back a half beat, as though the music itself was making room. Maya turned. Kang Dong-hae entered the way powerful men enter spaces they already own, without looking around, because looking around implies uncertainty. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so precisely fitted it seemed architectural. His hands, the tattooed hand she had clocked from across the room during setup, when his reservation had passed through the staff briefing with a single quiet instruction from the manager, perfect service, no exceptions, no delays, were clasped loosely in front of him. He was not a large man. He didn't need to be. The space around him reorganized itself automatically, the way iron filings organize around a magnetic field. His face was the most dangerous kind of face, calm. Specifically, deliberately, professionally calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of violence but its most controlled expression. 2 men flanked him at a distance that was casual enough to be invisible and precise enough to be architectural. They wore suits. They watched everything. And then there was Victoria. She entered half a step behind her husband, which, Maya understood immediately, was the only concession Victoria Sterling made to anyone. She was striking in the way that very expensive, very deliberate things are striking: ice blue silk dress, a gold chain necklace with the quiet weight of generational money, diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light and threw it back harder. Her hair was swept up with the kind of effortless perfection that costs significant effort. She was laughing at something, or performing laughter, the distinction being one Maya had learned to make quickly, her head tilted back just enough to ensure the room noticed her arrival. She noticed the room noticing. She required it. Maya watched Victoria's eyes move across the dining space with the practiced sweep of a woman cataloging the relative status of every person present. It took approximately 4 seconds. Her gaze passed over Maya the way it passed over the coat rack, registering presence, assigning category, moving on. Furniture in an apron. The maitre d' led them to the corner table, Obsidian's most secluded, the one reserved for guests whose privacy was either a preference or a necessity. Maya's section. Of course it was her section. She finished refilling the water glass, set the pitcher down, and allowed herself exactly one breath to recalibrate. She had served senators, tech billionaires, and a man who was later indicted on 3 continents. She straightened her apron and walked toward the table. The first 20 minutes went smoothly enough. Maya took their order with the precise, unhurried professionalism that had kept her employed at Obsidian for 2 years. She presented the evening specials without rushing. She recommended the wagyu with the quiet confidence of someone who had memorized the provenance of every cut on the menu. Kang ordered without looking at the menu, his Korean accented with the particular flatness of a man who had spent equal time in Seoul and Los Angeles. He did not acknowledge Maya beyond the transaction. Victoria ordered a specific vintage of Burgundy that they didn't carry, then accepted the alternative Maya suggested with the magnanimous tolerance of someone doing a lesser person a profound favor. The 2 flanking men sat at the adjacent table and ordered nothing. Maya moved. She poured. She disappeared. She reappeared. She was, by every professional measure, invisible, which was exactly how she needed to be. The trouble started with the wine. Obsidian's cellar had received a new shipment that afternoon, and the inventory system had not been fully updated. When Maya returned to the table with the decanted Burgundy, she was 40 seconds behind the window she had mentally set for herself. Not late by any reasonable standard. Late by Victoria Sterling's standard, which operated on a different, more personal calibration. Victoria didn't say anything immediately. She watched Maya set the decanter down. She watched Maya pour the first measure into Kang's glass. She picked up her own empty glass, looked at it, then looked at Maya with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement, something that lived between the two, in the particular territory occupied by people who have never been told no by anyone in a service position. Then she turned to her husband and began to speak in Korean. Not the careful, neutral Korean of someone making a private comment. The fast, fluid, Seoul district Korean of someone who has decided that the person standing in front of them does not register as an audience. Her voice stayed low. Her smile stayed in place, that same performed smile she had worn through the entrance. To anyone watching from across the room, it looked like a wife sharing a light observation with her husband over a lovely dinner. The performance was immaculate. The words were not. Maya's Korean was academic in its foundation but street fluent in its comprehension. She had spent 3 years in Seoul during her doctoral research, living in a Mapogu apartment and buying groceries and arguing with landlords and attending lectures where professors spoke for hours without concession to foreign ears. She understood every register, from the formal honorifics of court documents to the precise, cutting vernacular of a wealthy Seoul woman who had decided that a black waitress standing 2 feet away was as comprehending as the furniture she resembled. Victoria called her a Jimsung Gadian Jiat, something like a beast of burden. A work animal. She said it the way you describe an inanimate object, without heat, without hesitation, with the breezy confidence of someone narrating their own life to an appreciative audience of one. She added that Maya moved with the awareness of a person whose thoughts stop at the edge of the plate she's carrying. She finished by suggesting to Kang that establishments like this really should have higher standards, not in the food, which was acceptable, but in what they chose to decorate the floor with. She reached for her wine glass as she finished, still smiling. Kang said nothing. But his chopsticks had gone still. And Maya, standing at that table with the decanter in her hand and 6 years of East Asian scholarship detonating quietly behind her eyes, made a decision. She set the decanter down. There is a form of Korean called jeondimul that most modern speakers encounter only in historical dramas and academic texts. It is the language of the Joseon royal court, layered, architectural, devastating in its precision. It doesn't just communicate meaning. It assigns rank. It places the speaker above or below the listener with the surgical efficiency of a blade finding the exact space between ribs. In the wrong mouth, it sounds performative. In the right mouth, it sounds like a verdict. Maya had spent 2 years studying it specifically because her dissertation argued that the hierarchical structure of honorific Korean revealed more about the psychology of power than any sociological framework ever written about the peninsula. She cleared her throat once, quietly, almost apologetically. And then she spoke. The Korean that came out of Maya's mouth was not the serviceable, conversational Korean of a foreign student who had done their time in Seoul. It was Jeondaemal in its fullest, most deliberate form. The register you use to address someone whose behavior had placed them beneath the dignity of a direct response, delivered with the measured cadence of someone reading a formal decree. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She told Victoria, in language that would have been immediately recognized by anyone at that table with a serious Korean education, that she had heard every word. That she understood not just the vocabulary but the specific Gangnam district inflection Victoria had used, which told Maya precisely where she had grown up, what schools she had likely attended, and what kind of household had produced someone who confused the ability to purchase proximity to power with the possession of it. She noted, with the particular formality of Jeondaemal, that a woman of genuine Yangban lineage, the Korean aristocracy Victoria's speech patterns were performing, would sooner swallow her own tongue than reduce herself to insulting service staff. That such behavior was not the mark of elevated breeding but its precise opposite. That true royalty, as the proverb goes, does not bark. It does not need to. She finished by addressing Victoria with a specific honorific, one reserved historically for women of high court position, deployed here with a precision that made it function as its own commentary. Used sincerely, it was the highest compliment. Used the way Maya used it, with that exact pause before it and that exact stillness after, it was a mirror. It reflected everything Victoria was not. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the room had produced before. The jazz quartet had stopped. Maya would never be certain whether they had heard or simply sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure, but the music was gone. The table nearest to them, occupied by 2 entertainment lawyers who had been in animated conversation for the past hour, had gone completely still. Even the candlelight seemed to pause, the flames standing straighter, as though the air itself had decided to pay attention. Victoria Sterling's smile did not fade gradually. It stopped. Like a power cut. Like the precise moment a screen goes dark. The wine glass she had just lifted was still in her hand, suspended halfway to her mouth, forgotten entirely. The color moved out of her face in a slow, definitive tide, not a blush, not embarrassment's usual warmth, but something colder. The particular pallor of a person who has just understood, fully and without exit, that they have made an irreversible miscalculation. Kang Dong-hae slowly set his chopsticks down parallel across his plate. He did not look at Maya. He looked at his wife. And the look on his face was worse than anything he could have said. The manager's name was Daniel Hess, and he had worked in luxury hospitality for 19 years by perfecting one specific skill, reading a room and immediately siding with whoever held the most power in it. He appeared at Maya's elbow within 90 seconds. She didn't know who had signaled him. Perhaps someone on the floor. Perhaps one of the 2 silent men at the adjacent table, who had straightened almost imperceptibly when Maya began speaking and had not relaxed since. It didn't matter. Daniel was there, and his face carried the expression she had seen him deploy before, a careful compound of professional concern and preemptive apology, designed to communicate to the guest that the situation was already being handled and to communicate to the staff member that their employment was already past tense. He touched her elbow lightly. Maya. A word. She went. Not because she was afraid, but because she had said what needed saying and she was finished with the table. He walked her to the narrow corridor behind the host station, far enough from the dining room to be private, close enough that she could still hear the ambient silence she had created. He didn't waste time. Daniel Hess had not survived 19 years in this industry by being indirect with people he was about to discard. I'm going to need your apron and your locker key tonight, he said. His voice was not unkind, which was almost worse than if it had been. Whatever happened out there, and I'm not asking, that table represents relationships this restaurant has spent 4 years building. I can't. I understand, Maya said. He blinked. He had clearly prepared for more resistance. Your final check will be processed by. I understand, Daniel. She removed her apron with the same deliberate, unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. Folded it once. Placed it in his hands. Retrieved her locker key from her pocket and set it on top of the folded fabric with a small, final click that sounded, in that narrow corridor, louder than it had any right to. She collected her bag from the locker room, her jacket from the hook, and her phone from the shelf where she left it during shifts. She did not look back at the dining room. She had learned a long time ago that looking back at things that were already over was a luxury she couldn't afford. The LA rain greeted her on the sidewalk like an old, unwelcome acquaintance. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic rain of movies set in this city, Los Angeles rarely committed to weather. It was the hesitant, persistent drizzle that felt more like the sky was anxious than grieving. It dampened her jacket and turned the boulevard's neon into watercolor and did absolutely nothing to address the $80,000 figure that had begun its familiar rotation in the back of her mind the moment Daniel said apron. She stood under the restaurant's awning and did the math she already knew the answer to. 2 weeks until Marcus's next treatment cycle. 11 days until rent. A savings account that functioned more as a monument to good intentions than an actual financial resource. She had her phone out, thumb hovering over her rideshare app, when she ran the numbers one more time and decided the bus was fine. The bus was always fine. She had made decisions of consequence on that bus. She had read entire centuries of Korean history on that bus. She stepped off the curb into the drizzle and started walking toward the stop on Wilshire, her dissertation notes still open on her phone, her breath steady, her jaw set in the particular way it set when she was converting fear into forward motion. She had been invisible for 2 years. At least now, she thought, she had been seen. Behind her, idling at the curb in the rain, a black sedan sat very still with its lights on. It had been there since she walked out the door. The sedan's window came down when she was 12 steps past it. Maya heard it, the quiet mechanical descent, barely audible beneath the drizzle, and felt it the same way she had felt Kang's arrival in the dining room. Not as sound. As pressure. She stopped walking. Not from fear, exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone whose instincts had been sharpened by 2 years of reading dangerous people across a dinner table. She turned. The man in the passenger seat was one of the two from the adjacent table. Up close he was younger than she'd clocked him, mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that isn't natural but trained. He didn't lean out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her with the patient, neutral expression of someone delivering a message they have delivered many times before. Mr. Kang would like 5 minutes of your time. His English was precise, lightly accented. He asks that you consider it a conversation, not a request. Maya stood in the drizzle and considered the sedan and the man and the very careful phrasing of that last sentence. He's still inside, she said. He left through the kitchen 2 minutes after you did. A pause. He anticipated that Mr. Hess would handle the situation the way Mr. Hess handles situations. Something about that, the dry accuracy of it, almost made her smile. She didn't. She looked at the sedan's rear window, darkened and unreadable, and thought about Marcus and the pale blue envelope on her kitchen counter and the $400 monthly gap that had been widening incrementally for 6 months. She got in. Kang Dong-hae was sitting behind the driver, jacket still immaculate, hands folded in his lap. In the confined space of the vehicle he was somehow even more controlled than he had been in the restaurant, the composed energy of a man who had learned to make small spaces feel like they belonged to him. He did not look up immediately when she settled into the seat across from him. He finished whatever thought he was completing, then raised his eyes to hers. Your dissertation, he said, in English that carried the faint architecture of a Seoul education. East Asian Studies. The honorific registers of the late Joseon court. It was not a question. You studied under Professor Lim Jae-won at Yonsei. Your second chapter argued that John Demel was less a language system than a psychological instrument. He paused. I found it very persuasive. Maya said nothing. The specific quality of her silence asked the question she wasn't going to ask out loud. Kang almost smiled. I do my research before I bring people into rooms I care about. I knew what you were before Victoria decided to conduct her own assessment. He unfolded his hands. I want to apologize for my wife's behavior. But that is not why you are in this car. He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document. He placed it on the seat between them without opening it. I have a port expansion negotiation closing in 9 days. $500 million, a partnership with the Shin faction out of Busan, and a translation team I no longer trust. He let that land. The lead interpreter has been presenting me with cleaned Korean and keeping the subtext for himself. I need someone who understands not just what is being said, but what is being meant, the register, the implication, the thing beneath the thing. He looked at her steadily. You heard a private conversation across a dining room and answered it in a dialect my own wife cannot fully command. He nodded once, almost to himself. I don't need an apology from you, Ms. Jenkins. I need your ear. The sedan moved smoothly into the wet Los Angeles night. Maya looked at the folded document between them and thought about Marcus. She picked it up. The meeting was held in a private floor of a Koreatown high-rise that had no listing on any directory Maya had ever seen, accessed by an elevator that required a card key and the specific patience of someone who understood that the pause between floors was not mechanical delay but deliberate, a moment engineered to remind you that you were entering a different jurisdiction entirely. Kang had given her 4 days. She had used them the way she used every resource available to her, completely. She read everything he sent her about the Shin faction. She cross-referenced their public business filings with academic papers on Busan-dialect commercial language, the specific vocabulary of port logistics negotiations, the way certain regional idioms functioned as coded signals in high-stakes Korean business culture. She slept 4 hours a night and did not complain about it because Marcus's treatment calendar was taped to her refrigerator and it was a more persuasive alarm clock than anything electronic. She dressed carefully on the morning of the meeting. Not to impress. To disappear into the room's expectations of her, a quiet, professional presence whose function was technical and whose observations would therefore go unguarded around. There were 11 people in the room when she entered. 8 from the Shin faction, identifiable by the particular coordinated formality of men who had rehearsed their presentation of unity. 2 of Kang's men. And the interpreter, a slight, immaculately dressed man in his 40s named Paul Yoon, who had been introduced to Maya 2 days prior with the specific energy of someone who found her presence professionally irritating and personally threatening. She had catalogued that energy and filed it carefully. She took her position at the periphery of the room, notepad open, pen moving, everything about her posture communicating the attentive blankness of a support function. A piece of furniture with a pen. She had spent 2 years perfecting that particular invisibility. Tonight it was a weapon. The negotiations opened in the formal register of Korean business, structured, honorific, the language of men performing goodwill for an audience. Maya tracked it fluently, her pen moving in the shorthand she had developed during doctoral seminars. For the first 30 minutes, Paul Yoon's translations were accurate in their surface content and subtly, consistently wrong in their emotional register. He was softening the Shin faction's language, translating their clipped, pressurized phrasing into something warmer and more collegial than the Korean actually was. Making them sound like partners when they were sounding, to Maya's ear, more like men concluding a transaction they had already privately completed. She wrote a single word in the margin of her notepad and underlined it twice. Performed. Then the lead Shin representative, a heavy-set man named Director Shin Byung-chul, who had said almost nothing for the first hour, leaned forward and made a specific comment about the timeline for the first phase transfer. He used a Busan regional idiom that was innocuous on its surface and functionally devastating in context. In the specific dialect of the southern port districts, the phrase he used, Myeonjeo Jangni Handa, carried a secondary meaning so embedded in regional usage that it would be invisible to anyone without hyperlocal linguistic knowledge. It meant, essentially, we clean house first. Paul Yoon translated it as we prioritize the initial phase. Maya's pen stopped moving. She kept her face completely neutral, her posture unchanged, her eyes on her notepad. She was furniture. She was a pen and a notepad and a function. But her mind was running at a frequency that had nothing to do with the room's performance of civility, and what it was processing, with growing and absolute certainty, was this. Kang Dong-hae was not being negotiated with. He was being managed toward an outcome he hadn't agreed to. And the man paid to be his ears was the one closing the door. She had exactly one move. Not because the room was dangerous, though it was, in every measurable sense, but because the nature of what she was about to do required the kind of precision that collapses under the weight of a second attempt. You could not accuse a man like Paul Yoon of deliberate mistranslation in front of 11 people, 6 of whom had financial incentive to see Kang sign a document that would eventually require his removal, and survive the accusation being wrong. Wrong, in this room, was not an academic grade. It was a consequence measured in entirely different units. She waited. This was the part that required the most discipline, not the move itself, but the patience to find the exact moment in which it would land with maximum exposure and minimum deniability. It came 12 minutes later. Director Shin Byung-chul was walking through the final structure of the port transfer timeline, his language growing incrementally more relaxed as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, the specific loosening of a man approaching the finish line of a performance he believed had succeeded. And in that loosening, he made the kind of mistake that only the overconfident make. He used a second regional idiom, this one even more deeply embedded in Busan Port District vernacular. The phrase was Bada Ga Ita, literally, the sea exists, which in southern port business culture carried the layered implication of something being deliberately drowned. Made to disappear beneath the surface. In context, directed at the timeline he was describing, it meant the first phase funds would be redirected before Kang's accounts received confirmation. Paul Yoon translated it as the foundation is solid. Maya set her pen down. She did it quietly, the way she had set the wine decanter down in Obsidian's dining room, with the deliberate precision of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is at complete peace with it. Then she spoke, in Korean, directly into the center of the room. She did not address Paul Yoon. She addressed Director Shin. She used his full title and the correct formal honorific, which immediately signaled to every Korean speaker present that what she was about to say was not an interruption but a formal entry into the proceedings. Then she repeated his phrase back to him, Bada Ga Ita, and asked him, with the measured, almost academic curiosity of someone genuinely interested in regional linguistics, whether he was using the phrase in its standard literary sense or in its Busan Port District commercial application. The question was a scalpel. Because there was no version of his answer that didn't open the wound. If he claimed the literary meaning, she could demonstrate, and she was prepared to demonstrate, at length, with specific citations, that the phrase in literary Korean made no grammatical sense in the context of a financial timeline. If he acknowledged the regional application, he had confirmed that the phrase meant exactly what Maya had understood it to mean. The silence that followed her question was the longest silence she had ever personally generated, and she had generated some significant ones. Director Shin's composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then his eyes moved, just fractionally, involuntarily, to Paul Yoon. That was everything. A man with nothing to hide does not look at his interpreter when his language is questioned. He looks at the person who questioned it. Kang saw it. She knew he saw it because his hands, folded on the table in front of him, went completely still in the way that very controlled people go still when something they suspected has just been confirmed. He turned to Paul Yoon with the terrible, quiet calm she had first seen directed at Victoria in Obsidian's dining room. Translate, Kang said softly, exactly what she just explained. Paul Yoon did not translate. Paul Yoon, for the first time since Maya had entered this building, had absolutely nothing to say. The Shin faction left the building 40 minutes later. Maya didn't witness the full conversation that followed her exposure of Paul Yoon. Kang had asked her, with a courtesy that functioned more like a command, to wait in an adjacent room while he concluded the meeting. She sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than 6 months of her Obsidian salary and looked at her phone and read the message Marcus had sent 3 hours ago, a photograph of himself mid-laugh at something a nurse had said, his hospital bracelet visible on his wrist, his face carrying the particular brightness of someone who had decided to be grateful for the exact life they had. She stared at it for a long time. When Kang entered the room he was alone, which told her something. He sat across from her without the architecture of the negotiating table between them and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, not the dangerous calm of the dining room, not the calculating assessment of the sedan. Something quieter. Something that had, at its edges, the faint and unfamiliar shape of respect. The Shin faction will not be receiving a contract, he said. Their translator has been conducting a secondary arrangement with a competing port authority for 11 months. We would have discovered this eventually. He paused. Eventually is an expensive word in my business. Maya said nothing. She had learned, in the past 4 days, that Kang Dong-hae was a man who arrived at his point on his own schedule and resented the shortcut. I want to offer you a permanent position, he said. Cultural liaison. You would travel with me to Seoul twice yearly, attend all significant negotiations involving Korean and East Asian counterparts, and function as my primary linguistic consultant on any deal above a certain threshold. He named a salary figure that made the $400 monthly gap in her brother's treatment budget feel like a historical artifact. You would have full autonomy over your methodology. No one tells you how to listen. Maya looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. I have a condition, she said. He didn't blink. One. She had thought about how to phrase this in the leather chair, while Marcus's photograph was still open on her phone. She had decided that directness was the only language worth speaking in this room. There is no community health clinic within 2 miles of my neighborhood in Koreatown. The nearest facility with immunotherapy capability is Cedars-Sinai, which is not accessible to most of the people who live within walking distance of my building. I want a clinic funded and operational within 18 months. Full immunotherapy suite, sliding scale billing, staffed by practitioners who speak the languages of the community they serve. She held his gaze. That is my condition. Kang studied her for a long moment. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man recalibrating, not his decision, but his assessment of the person sitting across from him. Victoria, he said finally, will be returning to Seoul next week. Indefinitely. He said it without drama, the way you state a logistical fact. She will not be a consideration in your working environment. Maya nodded once. The clinic, he said, will be funded within 30 days of your first working day. He extended his hand across the space between them. These are not negotiable reductions. They are the terms as you stated them. Maya looked at his hand. She thought about the water stain on her ceiling that looked like a continent. She thought about 6 years of dissertation work sitting unfinished on a laptop. She thought about Marcus laughing in a hospital bracelet and the pale blue envelope under the ceramic mug and 2 years of being furniture in an apron in a room full of people who had never once considered what the furniture might know. She shook his hand. Outside, Los Angeles was still raining, that same hesitant, persistent drizzle, but when she walked out of the building 40 minutes later, she walked into it differently. Not like someone calculating the cost of a rideshare. Not like someone converting fear into forward motion one bus stop at a time. She walked into it like someone who had just been given a seat at a table she once served. And this time, she intended to stay. Maya Jenkins reminds us that true worth was never determined by the uniform we wear or the tables we serve. It is determined by our knowledge, our character, and the courage to speak when the world expects our silence. Maya had a gift the room had completely overlooked. But when Victoria Sterling chose cruelty over class, Maya was ready. She turned an insult into an opportunity, and an opportunity into a seat at the most powerful table in the city. She didn't just earn respect, she used it to build something that would outlast that dining room forever. True power was never about being the loudest person at the table, the way Victoria believed. It is about being the person who understands exactly what is really being said. What did you think of Maya's story? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were capable of? Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to Soulwoven Stories for more powerful tales of dignity, karma, and triumph. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.